Walter Higgins disappeared every Tuesday at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, and for 40 years, his wife Martha never asked why. She watched him from the kitchen window as he climbed into his old Ford pickup, the same truck he'd driven since 1979. Its blue paint faded to the color of forgotten sky. He never said goodbye, never offered explanation. Just keys in hand, boots on gravel, engine turning over with that familiar cough that sounded like an old man clearing his throat before speaking a truth he'd rather keep buried. Martha stood at that window every Tuesday, dish towel in her hands, watching the dust settle on the driveway long after he'd gone. And every Tuesday, the same question twisted in her chest like a knife she couldn't pull free. Where does he go? For 40 years, she told herself it didn't matter. For 40 years, she convinced herself that some silences were sacred, that some doors were meant to stay closed. But lately, the silence had grown heavier. Lately, she'd begun to notice things. The way his hands trembled when he returned. The dirt under his fingernails that soap couldn't quite reach. The exhaustion in his eyes that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with weight. Walter was 78 years old. His body had begun the slow betrayal that comes to all men who live long enough to see their strength become memory. His knees ached, his back bent. His breathing came harder now, especially on the stairs. But every Tuesday, without fail, he climbed into that truck and drove away to a place he would not name. And Martha, 76 and sharp as the day they'd married, had begun to fear the worst. The house they shared sat on the edge of a small town in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, except when they chose not to. Their neighbors were kind but distant, the way people are when they sense a story too heavy to carry. The Higgins couple had always been private, polite, present at church on Sundays, absent from gossip, generous with casseroles when someone died, but never lingering long enough to answer questions about themselves. Martha had learned early in their marriage that Walter carried things he would not share. He'd come back from Vietnam in 1971, 26 years old and hollow-eyed, and she'd married him anyway, because she loved him, and because she believed love could fill the empty spaces. For a while, it had. They'd built a life, a home, a routine that felt like safety. But the Tuesdays had always been there, like a shadow neither of them acknowledged. It was a cold morning in late October when Martha made her decision. The leaves had turned the color of rust and blood, and the wind carried the smell of winter coming. She'd woken early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a clarity that felt like surrender. She was going to follow him, not because she didn't trust him, but because she needed to know, because the not knowing had become its own kind of death, slow and suffocating, and she was tired of dying in silence. Walter came downstairs at 1:30, same as always. He wore his flannel shirt, the green one with the frayed collar, and his work boots that were too heavy for a man his age, but that he refused to replace. He poured himself a cup of coffee, drank it standing at the counter, and said nothing. Martha pretended to read the newspaper. Her heart hammered against her ribs. At 2:15 he picked up his keys. "I'll be back before dark," he said, same as always. "Drive safe," she replied, same as always. The door closed. The truck started. The gravel crunched. Martha waited exactly 3 minutes. Then she grabbed her purse, her coat, and the keys to her sedan, and she followed him. The roads were empty. The sky was the color of old concrete, low and heavy with the promise of rain. Martha kept her distance, hanging back far enough that Walter wouldn't notice her in his rearview mirror, but close enough that she wouldn't lose him. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. She felt like a stranger in her own life, like she'd stepped outside the boundaries of the marriage she'd built and into some other territory where the rules no longer applied. Part of her wanted to turn back. Part of her wanted to pretend she'd never started. But the larger part, the part that had been growing for 40 years, pushed her forward. Walter drove for 20 minutes, heading east toward the county line. He didn't speed, didn't waver. He drove like a man who'd made this trip 1,000 times, which Martha realized with a sinking feeling he had. They passed the grocery store where she shopped every Thursday, the diner where they ate breakfast on Saturdays, the church where they'd been married 52 years ago, its white steeple still bright against the grey sky. Everything familiar, everything ordinary, and yet Martha felt like she was travelling into foreign country. Walter turned onto a narrow road that wound through farmland, past fields gone fallow for the season, past barns leaning into their own collapse. Martha's pulse quickened. She'd never been this way before, never had reason to. The road climbed a low hill, and at the top she saw it, the iron gates of a cemetery. Not just any cemetery. The sign read, Riverside Veterans Memorial Cemetery. Martha's breath caught. She slowed the car, pulling onto the shoulder as Walter's truck passed through the gates and disappeared down the winding drive. She sat there for a long moment, engine idling, mind racing. A cemetery. He'd been coming to a cemetery for 40 years. Relief and confusion tangled in her chest. Not another woman. Not a bar, not some secret second life she'd imagined in her darkest moments, but a cemetery, a place for the dead. Martha pulled forward slowly, easing through the gates. The cemetery was vast, rolling hills dotted with white headstones that stretched as far as she could see. It was beautiful in the way that places of mourning often are, quiet and solemn and heavy with memory. She followed the drive, keeping Walter's truck in sight, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and something else she couldn't name. Walter didn't stop at the main section where the graves were neat and tended, where fresh flowers marked the recent dead and polished stones gleamed in the weak sunlight. He drove past all of it, following a smaller, rougher road that led to the far edge of the cemetery, where the land sloped down toward a line of trees, and the headstones grew older, smaller, less distinct. Martha parked behind a maintenance shed and watched as Walter climbed out of his truck. He moved slowly, stiffly, like a man whose body had long since stopped cooperating with his will. From the truck bed, he pulled out a bucket, a plastic jug of water, and something small that Martha couldn't quite see. Then he walked into the oldest section of the cemetery, the part that looked forgotten. The headstones here were different, smaller, simpler. Many were so weathered that the names had been worn away by decades of rain and wind. Weeds grew thick between the graves. Leaves had piled in drifts against the stones. There were no flowers here, no flags, no signs that anyone remembered the men buried beneath this ground. Martha watched from a distance, hidden behind the shed, as Walter knelt in front of the first headstone. His knees cracked audibly, even from where she stood. He set down the bucket, unscrewed the cap on the water jug, and poured water over the face of the stone. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a toothbrush. A toothbrush. Martha's throat tightened. Walter began to scrub. Slowly, methodically, he worked the bristles into the grooves of the stone, washing away the dirt and moss and grime that had accumulated over years of neglect. His hands shook. His breathing was labored, but he didn't stop. When the first stone was clean, he moved to the second, then the third, then the fourth. Martha stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. She watched as her husband, the man she'd slept beside for 52 years, the man whose body she knew better than her own, knelt in the dirt, and scrubbed the graves of strangers. No, not strangers, soldiers. The realization hit her like a fist to the chest. These were soldiers, men who died in service, men whose names had been forgotten, men whose graves no one tended, and Walter had been tending them for 40 years. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. Martha's legs trembled. She leaned against the shed, her vision blurring with tears she hadn't realized were falling. She thought of all the Tuesdays, all the years, all the times she'd wondered and worried and imagined the worst. And all along, Walter had been here, doing this. But why? The question burned in her mind, demanding an answer. She wanted to walk out there, to confront him, to ask him why he'd kept this secret for so long. But something held her back. Some instinct that told her this was sacred ground in more ways than one, and that interrupting would be a violation she couldn't take back. So she watched. Walter worked for over an hour. He cleaned 12 headstones in total, moving from one to the next with a kind of reverence that made Martha's chest ache. He didn't rush, didn't cut corners. He treated each stone like it mattered, like the man buried beneath it mattered, like the act of remembering was the most important thing in the world. When he finished cleaning, he did something that broke Martha's heart completely. He talked to them. She couldn't hear the words from where she stood, but she could see his lips moving. She could see the way he rested his hand on each stone, the way he bowed his head, the way his shoulders shook with something that might have been grief, or might have been something else entirely. He stayed like that for a long time, long enough that the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, long enough that the temperature dropped, and Martha's fingers went numb inside her coat pockets, long enough that she began to understand, in some wordless way, that this was not just a ritual. This was a promise. Walter finally stood, his movements slow and painful. He gathered his bucket and his water jug and his toothbrush, and he walked back to his truck. Martha ducked lower behind the shed, her heart hammering, terrified that he would see her. But Walter didn't look around. He climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove away, back down the winding road toward the gates. Martha waited until he was out of sight. Then she walked out into the section he'd been tending. The headstones were small and plain, most of them marked only with a name, a rank, and a date. Some had no names at all, just numbers. She read the inscriptions, her throat tight. PFC James Collier, 1949, 1968. CPL David Nguyen, 1950, 1970. Pivot Michael Torres, 1948, 1967. Unknown soldier, Vietnam War, Vietnam. They were all Vietnam. Martha sank to her knees in front of one of the stones Walter had cleaned. The name was barely legible even now. SPC Robert Hayes, 1951, 1971. She reached out and touched the stone, felt the cold granite beneath her fingers, and she understood. These were Walter's men. Not all of them, not literally, but men like his men. Boys who'd gone to war and never come home. Boys whose families had forgotten them or never claimed them. Boys who'd been buried here in this forgotten corner of a veteran's cemetery. Their graves left to the mercy of time and weather and indifference. And Walter had been coming here every Tuesday for 40 years to make sure they weren't forgotten. Martha pressed her hand to her mouth and wept. She drove home in a daze, her mind spinning, her heart too full and too broken to make sense of what she'd seen. By the time she pulled into the driveway, Walter's truck was already there, parked in its usual spot. The house lights were on. Smoke rose from the chimney. Martha sat in the car for a long moment, trying to compose herself. Her eyes were red. Her hands were shaking. She felt like she'd been turned inside out, like every assumption she'd ever made about her husband had been stripped away to reveal something deeper and more painful than she'd ever imagined. She walked into the house. Walter was in the living room sitting in his recliner, the television on but muted. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment their eyes met. Martha saw something flicker across his face. Recognition maybe, or fear, but then it was gone, replaced by the same quiet mask he'd worn for 52 years. "You're home," he said. "So are you," she replied. They stared at each other. The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile, like glass about to shatter. Martha wanted to say something, wanted to tell him she knew, wanted to ask him why he'd never told her, why he'd carried this alone for so long, why he'd thought she couldn't handle the truth. But the words wouldn't come. They lodged in her throat, too big and too complicated to force out. So instead she said, "I'll start dinner." And Walter said, "Thank you." And the moment passed. That night Martha lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Walter slept beside her. She listened to the sound of his breathing, slow and steady, and she thought about the graves. The toothbrush, the way his hands had trembled as he scrubbed away the dirt. She thought about the boys buried in that forgotten section of the cemetery. Boys who'd been someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. Boys who'd gone to war because their country had asked them to, and who'd come home in boxes or not at all. Boys whose names had faded from memory, whose graves had been left to rot. And she thought about Walter, about the weight he'd been carrying, about the promise he'd made, though she didn't yet know what that promise was or to whom he'd made it. She thought about 40 years of Tuesdays, 40 years of silence, 40 years of him driving to that cemetery, kneeling in the dirt, scrubbing stones with a toothbrush, talking to the dead. And she thought about the fact that he'd never once asked her to come with him. Why? The question burned in her mind, refusing to let her sleep. Was it shame? Pride? Did he think she wouldn't understand? Did he think she would judge him? Or was it something else, something deeper, something he couldn't put into words even if he tried? Martha rolled onto her side and looked at her husband's face in the darkness. He looked old, fragile. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the years, carved by time and grief and things he would not name. His hair was white now, thin and wispy. His hands, resting on the blanket, were spotted with age and scarred from decades of work. He looked like a man who'd lived a long life, but he also looked like a man who'd never stopped fighting a war that had ended 50 years ago. Martha reached out and touched his hand. He didn't wake, but his fingers twitched just slightly, as if even in sleep he was reaching for something he couldn't hold. The next Tuesday came. Martha woke early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a decision already made. She wasn't going to follow him this time. She wasn't going to hide behind sheds and watch from a distance. She was going to wait, and when he came home, she was going to ask him. She was going to break the silence. Walter came downstairs at 1:30, same as always. He poured his coffee, drank it standing, said nothing. At 2:15 he picked up his keys. "I'll be back before dark," he said. Martha stood. Her heart pounded. Her mouth was dry. "Walter," she said. He stopped, turned, looked at her with those tired, guarded eyes. "Where do you go?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them, sharp and unavoidable. Walter's face didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. But something shifted in his expression, something small and painful, like a door cracking open just enough to let in a sliver of light. "Nowhere important," he said finally. "Don't lie to me," Martha said, and her voice broke. "Please, not after 52 years. Don't lie to me." Walter's jaw tightened. His hand gripped the keys so hard his knuckles went white. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, he said, "It's something I have to do." "Why?" "Because I promised." "Promised who?" Walter looked at her then, really looked at her, and Martha saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but something raw and unguarded and utterly devastating. "Men who can't ask any more," he said, and then he walked out the door. Martha stood in the kitchen trembling, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to scream, wanted to throw something, wanted to run after him and demand a real answer, a full answer, an answer that made sense. But she didn't, because she understood in that moment that Walter's silence wasn't about her. It wasn't about trust or love or the strength of their marriage. It was about something else entirely. Something he'd been carrying alone for so long that he didn't know how to share it, didn't know how to let someone else bear the weight. And she understood too that if she wanted the truth, she was going to have to take it. So she grabbed her coat, her purse, and her keys, and she followed him again. This time, she didn't hide. She drove through the gates of the cemetery and followed the winding road to the forgotten section where the old graves lay. She parked beside Walter's truck, got out, and walked toward him. He was kneeling in front of a headstone, toothbrush in hand, scrubbing away the grime. He didn't look up when she approached, didn't acknowledge her presence, but his hands stilled just for a moment, and she knew he'd heard her. Martha stood a few feet away, looking down at the grave he was tending. The name was barely visible. President Thomas Lee, 1950-1969. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. Walter didn't answer. He dipped the toothbrush in the bucket, wrung it out, and kept scrubbing. "Walter," she said, her voice firmer now. "How long?" 40 years, he said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's not your burden." "But it's yours?" He stopped scrubbing. His shoulders sagged. He looked down at the grave, at the name he'd just cleaned, and he said, "Yes." Martha's chest ached. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to pull him into her arms and tell him he didn't have to carry this alone. But something held her back. Some instinct that told her this moment was fragile, that pushing too hard would shatter it completely. So instead, she knelt beside him. Walter's head snapped up. He stared at her, eyes wide, mouth open, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Helping," she said. "Martha, give me the toothbrush." "You don't have to." "Give me the toothbrush, Walter." He hesitated. Then, slowly, he handed it to her. Martha dipped the brush in the bucket, wrung it out, and began to scrub. The bristles scraped against the stone, rough and grating, but she didn't stop. She worked in silence, side by side with her husband, cleaning the grave of a boy she'd never known, a boy who died before she'd even met Walter, a boy whose name was almost gone. And as she scrubbed, she felt something shift between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not understanding, but something close, something like the beginning of a bridge across the silence that had separated them for 40 years. They worked until the sun began to set, cleaning 6 graves in total. Walter didn't talk much, but every now and then he would pause and say something small, a name, a detail, a memory. "This one was 19, he said, pointing to a stone marked CPL Stephen Park. 1949-1968, died 2 weeks before he was supposed to go home. "This one saved my life," he said, touching a stone marked Sergeant William Cross, 1947-1970. "Took a bullet meant for me." "This one," he said, kneeling in front of a stone with no name, just a number. "I never knew, but someone did. Someone loved him, and no one should die without someone remembering." Martha listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. She just listened, and she scrubbed, and she let Walter's words fill the silence that had lived between them for so long. When they finally finished, the sky was streaked with orange and purple, the last light of day fading into dusk. Walter stood slowly, his knees cracking, his back stiff. He looked at Martha, and for the first time in 40 years, he didn't look guarded. He looked tired, grateful, and something else. He looked seen. "Thank you," he said. Martha took his hand. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Walter's eyes filled with tears. He didn't speak, but he squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, and they stood there in the fading light, surrounded by the graves of forgotten soldiers, holding onto each other like they were the only solid thing left in the world. That night, they drove home together. Walter didn't say much, but he didn't need to. The silence between them was different now, softer, less like a wall, and more like a shared breath. When they got home, Martha made dinner. They ate at the kitchen table, the television off, the house quiet. And when they finished, Walter reached across the table and took her hand. "I made a promise," he said, "a long time ago, to my platoon. I told them that no matter what happened, no matter who came home and who didn't, I would make sure no one was forgotten. I would make sure no one's grave went untended. I would make sure they stayed clean." His voice broke. "I'm the only one left, Martha. I'm the only one who remembers their names. And if I stop, if I let those graves go dirty, then they're really gone. And I can't let that happen." Martha's throat tightened. She held his hand tighter. "You won't," she said, "because I'm going to help you." Walter looked at her, eyes wide, disbelieving. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. "I want to help you keep your promise." Walter's face crumpled. He bowed his head and his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Martha stood, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around him. She held him while he cried, held him while 40 years of grief and guilt and exhaustion poured out of him, held him until there was nothing left but the quiet sound of his breathing and the warmth of her arms. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. "You hear me? You're not alone." The following Tuesday, Martha woke early. She made coffee, packed a lunch, and filled 2 buckets with water. She gathered sponges, brushes, and rags. She put on her oldest clothes, her sturdy shoes, and her coat. When Walter came downstairs at 1:30, he stopped in the doorway and stared. "What are you doing?" he asked. Martha picked up one of the buckets and smiled. "Getting ready," she said. Walter's eyes filled with tears. He didn't say anything. He just walked over, took the other bucket, and kissed her forehead. At 2:15, they climbed into the truck together, and they drove to the cemetery. As they worked that first Tuesday together, Martha cleaning one grave while Walter cleaned another, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. On the back of several headstones hidden from casual view, someone had carved small symbols. Not names, not dates, just symbols. A star, a cross, a circle. "Walter," she said, pointing. "What are these?" Walter looked. His face went pale. "Those are markers," he said quietly. "We used them in Vietnam to identify each other in the field when we couldn't use names." Martha's heart skipped. "So these men were in my platoon," Walter finished. "Or platoons like mine, men I knew, men I served with." Martha stared at the symbols, her mind reeling. She'd thought Walter was tending the graves of strangers, but they weren't strangers. They were his brothers, his family, the men he'd fought beside, bled beside, watched die, and he'd been coming here every Tuesday for 40 years to keep them clean, to keep them remembered, to keep his promise. Martha looked at her husband, and she saw him clearly for the first time in their entire marriage. Not as the quiet man who never talked about the war, not as the husband who disappeared every Tuesday, but as the soldier who'd come home and spent the rest of his life making sure his brothers didn't stay buried and forgotten. "Walter," she whispered, "why didn't you tell me?" He looked at her, eyes red, voice breaking. "Because I didn't want you to see me like this," he said. "I didn't want you to know how broken I still am." Martha dropped the sponge. She crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and grabbed his face in both hands. "You're not broken," she said fiercely. "You're the strongest man I've ever known, and I'm proud of you. Do you hear me? I'm proud." Walter broke. He collapsed into her arms, sobbing, and Martha held him there among the graves of his brothers, held him while the weight of 40 years finally began to lift. The following Tuesday, Martha woke before dawn. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the moment Walter had broken down in her arms, the weight of 40 years of silence finally cracking open like a dam that could no longer hold. She lay in bed listening to his breathing, steady and deep, and she wondered how many nights he'd lain awake carrying this burden alone, how many mornings he'd woken with the names of dead men on his lips. She rose quietly, careful not to wake him, and went downstairs. The house was cold, the October chill seeping through the windows, but she didn't mind. She made coffee, strong and black the way Walter liked it, and she stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the fields beyond their property. The sky turned from black to grey to pale gold, and with each shift of light, Martha felt something inside her shift too, a resolve, a determination, a sense that she was stepping into a role she should have claimed decades ago. When Walter came downstairs at 6:30, earlier than usual, he found her already dressed in old jeans and a flannel shirt, her hair tied back, her face set with purpose. On the kitchen table sat 2 thermoses of coffee, 2 packed lunches, and a handwritten list. Walter stopped in the doorway, staring at the list. "What's this?" "Supplies we need," Martha said. "Better brushes, stronger soap, kneeling pads so your knees don't give out, gloves, a wagon to carry everything so you don't have to make multiple trips." Walter picked up the list, his hands trembling slightly. He read it twice, then looked at his wife with an expression she couldn't quite name. Disbelief, maybe, or gratitude so deep it had no words. "Martha, you don't have to—" "Stop!" she said, cutting him off. "Stop telling me I don't have to. I want to. I need to. Do you understand? I need to do this with you." Walter's throat worked. He set the list down carefully, like it was something precious, something fragile. "Why? Because you're my husband," Martha said simply. "Because I love you. Because you've been carrying this alone for 40 years, and I'll be damned if you carry it alone for one more day." Walter's eyes filled with tears. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. They stood like that for a long time. 2 people who'd lived side by side for half a century finally, truly standing together. "Thank you," Walter whispered into her hair. "Thank you." Martha pulled back just enough to look at him. "Now drink your coffee. We have work to do." They drove to the hardware store first, a small family-owned place on Main Street that had been there since before they were married. The owner, a man named Carl, who'd gone to high school with Walter, greeted them with surprise when they walked in together carrying Martha's list. "Well, this is a first," Carl said, grinning. "Martha Higgins in the hardware store. What brings you in, Mrs. Higgins?" "Cleaning supplies," Martha said briskly, handing him the list. "We need everything on here." Carl scanned the list, his eyebrows rising. "This is quite a bit of gear. You 2 starting a cleaning business?" "Something like that," Walter said quietly. Carl looked between them, his smile fading as he registered something in Walter's tone. something in the way Martha stood close to her husband with her hand on his arm. He nodded slowly. "I'll get this together for you. Give me 10 minutes." While Carl gathered the supplies, Martha wandered the aisles, picking up additional items she thought they might need. Trash bags for collecting debris, a small folding stool, extra rags. She moved with efficiency, with purpose, and Walter watched her with something like wonder. When they left the store, the bed of Walter's truck was loaded with supplies. Carl had thrown in a few extra items at no charge, kneeling pads and a good pair of work gloves for Martha. And when Walter tried to pay him, Carl waved him off. "On the house," Carl said. "Whatever you're doing, Walter, I hope it helps." Walter shook his hand. "It does, more than you know." They drove to the cemetery in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that comes when two people understand each other without needing words. The October morning was crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. The trees lining the road had turned full autumn, their leaves a riot of red and gold and orange, and the air smelled of wood smoke and dying grass. When they pulled through the gates of Riverside Veterans Memorial Cemetery, Martha felt a strange sense of homecoming, as if she'd been here before in some other life, as if this place had been waiting for her all along. They drove past the main section with its neat rows and polished stones, past the administrative building where a flag hung at half-mast, and down the rough road to the forgotten section where the old graves lay. Walter parked in the same spot he always did, beneath a gnarled oak tree whose roots had begun to buckle the pavement. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the headstones visible through the windshield. "There are 43 graves in this section," he said quietly. 43 men who died in Vietnam and ended up here because no one claimed them, or because their families couldn't afford anything better. I've been tending them for 40 years, and I still don't know all their stories. But I know their names. I know their ranks. I know the dates they died, and I make sure they're not forgotten. Martha reached over and took his hand. Now I'll know them too. They unloaded the supplies and carried them to the first grave. Walter moved slowly, his body stiff from age and decades of hard work. But Martha noticed he stood a little straighter today, carried himself with a little more ease, as if sharing the burden had already begun to lighten it. The first headstone they cleaned together belonged to Private First Class Daniel Reeves, who died in 1969 at the age of 20. The stone was heavily weathered, the letters nearly illegible, covered in moss and lichen and years of accumulated grime. Walter knelt in front of it, and Martha knelt beside him, and together they began to scrub. It was hard work, harder than Martha had expected. The moss clung stubbornly to the stone, and the lichen had to be scraped away with the edge of a putty knife. Her hands ached. Her knees hurt despite the kneeling pad. Her back protested the unfamiliar position, but she didn't stop. She worked steadily, methodically, following Walter's lead, and slowly, gradually, the name began to emerge from beneath the grime. Daniel Reeves, PFC, 1949-1969. When the stone was finally clean, Walter sat back on his heels and rested his hand on top of it, the way Martha had seen him do before. He closed his eyes and his lips moved silently, and Martha understood he was saying something to Daniel Reeves, something private, something sacred. She didn't interrupt. She simply waited, her own hand resting on the cold granite, and she thought about the boy buried beneath this ground. Daniel Reeves, 20 years old, barely more than a child. What had his life been like? What had he dreamed of? What had he left behind when he went to war? A mother? A father? A girlfriend waiting for letters that stopped coming? Martha would never know, but she could do this. She could make sure his name stayed visible. She could make sure someone remembered. They moved to the next grave, and the next, and the next. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only once to eat the sandwiches Martha had packed and drink coffee from the thermoses. The October sun climbed high and then began its descent, casting long shadows across the cemetery, and still they worked. Walter told her about the men as they cleaned. Not all of them. He didn't know all their stories, but the ones he did know, he shared. This one, he said, kneeling in front of a stone marked Corporal James Whitfield, was a medic, saved 12 men before he got hit, died trying to reach a 13th. This one, he said, touching a stone-marked specialist Robert Chen, played guitar, used to play for us at night when we couldn't sleep, sang Johnny Cash, died with his guitar still strapped to his back. This one, he said, his voice breaking, was my best friend. Martha looked at the stone. Sergeant William Cross, 1947 to 1970. He took a bullet meant for me, Walter said, his hand trembling as he traced the letters of the name. We were on patrol. I was point. I didn't see the sniper, but Billy did. He pushed me out of the way and took the round in the chest. Died before the medevac could get there. Died in my arms. Walter's face crumpled. I promised him I'd take care of his grave. Promised him I'd make sure he wasn't forgotten. And I've kept that promise. Every Tuesday for 40 years, I've come here and I've cleaned his stone. And I've told him I'm sorry. I've told him it should have been me. Martha's heart shattered. She dropped her brush and grabbed Walter's face in both hands, forcing him to look at her. It wasn't your fault, she said fiercely. Do you hear me, Walter Higgins? It wasn't your fault. Billy made a choice. He chose to save you, and you've honored that choice every single day since. You've kept your promise. You've kept him remembered. That's not guilt. That's love, Walter sobbed. Great, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He collapsed against her, and Martha held him, there in the dirt in front of Billy Cross's grave, held him while he cried for his best friend, for all the men he'd lost, for all the years he'd carried this weight alone. And as she held him, Martha cried too, for Walter, for Billy, for all the boys who'd gone to war and never come home, for all the families who'd lost sons and brothers and husbands, for all the graves that lay forgotten in this quiet corner of the cemetery. They stayed like that until the sun began to set, until the shadows grew long and the air turned cold. And when Walter finally pulled away, his eyes red and swollen, his face streaked with tears and dirt, he looked at Martha and said the words he'd been holding inside for 40 years. I'm tired, Martha. I'm so tired. I know, she said softly. I know you are, but you don't have to be tired alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Walter nodded. He took a shaky breath, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and picked up his brush. One more, he said. Just one more before we go. They cleaned Billy Cross's headstone together, working in silence as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. When they finished, the stone gleamed in the fading light, Billy's name clear and sharp and impossible to ignore. Walter rested his hand on the stone one last time. I'll see you next week, Billy, he said quietly. And I'm bringing Martha. She wants to meet you. Martha's throat tightened. She placed her hand beside Walter's, and together they sat in silence, honoring a man she'd never met, but who had saved the life of the man she loved. If this story touched your heart, click like and subscribe to honor those who served. They drove home as darkness fell, the truck's headlights cutting through the night. Walter was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not the heavy, burdened silence of before, but something softer, something like peace. When they got home, Martha ran a hot bath for Walter, knowing his body would be aching from the day's work. She made dinner while he soaked, simple comfort food, meatloaf and mashed potatoes and green beans. And when he came downstairs in his robe and slippers, moving stiffly but with a lightness in his eyes she hadn't seen in years, she had the table set and waiting. They ate slowly, savouring the food and the quiet companionship. And when they finished, Walter reached across the table and took Martha's hand. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Martha squeezed his hand. "I'm listening." Walter took a deep breath. "When I came home from Vietnam, I was 26 years old, and I felt like I was 100. I'd seen things no one should see, done things no one should have to do, lost friends, lost pieces of myself I knew I'd never get back. And I came home to a country that didn't want to hear about it, didn't want to know what we'd been through, didn't want us at all." His voice shook. "I was angry. I was broken. I didn't know how to live in a world that wasn't trying to kill me. And then I met you." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "You saved me, Martha. You gave me a reason to keep going. You gave me a home, a life, something worth living for. But I couldn't tell you about the war. I couldn't tell you about the things I'd seen, the things I'd done, the men I'd lost, because I was afraid if you really knew, you wouldn't love me anymore." "Walter, let me finish," he said gently. "Please." Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "So I kept it inside. I locked it away. And every Tuesday I went to that cemetery and I let it out. I talked to Billy and Daniel and James and all the others. I told them the things I couldn't tell you. I cried for them. I grieved for them. And then I came home and I pretended I was fine." Walter's voice broke. "But I wasn't fine. I've never been fine. And I'm sorry, Martha. I'm sorry I shut you out. I'm sorry I made you worry. I'm sorry I didn't trust you with the truth." Martha stood and walked around the table. She pulled Walter to his feet and wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "You have nothing to apologize for," she whispered. "Nothing. You did what you had to do to survive. And now we're going to do what we have to do to heal, together." Walter held her tight, his face buried in her shoulder, and for the first time in 40 years, he felt like he could breathe. The following Tuesday, they went to the cemetery again, and the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that. It became their routine, their shared mission, their way of honoring the men who'd given everything and received nothing in return. Martha learned the names of all 43 men in the forgotten section. She learned their ranks, their ages, the dates they'd died. She learned which stones were hardest to clean, which required extra care, which had symbols carved on the back that marked them as Walter's brothers in arms. And as she learned, she began to understand. She began to see the war not as some distant historical event, but as a living, breathing wound that had never fully healed. She began to understand why Walter had carried this burden alone, why he'd felt he had no choice, why he'd spent 40 years kneeling in the dirt, scrubbing headstones with a toothbrush, because it was the only way he knew how to say, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I survived when you didn't. I'm sorry I got to grow old when you stayed forever young. I'm sorry the world forgot you, but I never will." One Tuesday in late November, as they were finishing up for the day, Martha noticed something she hadn't seen before. At the far edge of the forgotten section, partially hidden by overgrown weeds and fallen leaves, was a small headstone she didn't recognize. "Walter!" she called. "There's one more over here." Walter walked over, his brow furrowed. He knelt down and began clearing away the debris, and as the stone emerged, his face went pale. The name on the stone was Lieutenant Marcus Higgins. 1945, 1970. Martha's breath caught. Higgins, Walter, is he my brother? Walter whispered, my older brother. Martha stared at him, stunned. You had a brother. You never told me you had a brother. Walter's hands shook as he traced the letters of the name. Marcus was 5 years older than me. He enlisted in 1967. I followed him in 1968. We served in different units, but we wrote letters. He was my hero, Martha, my big brother, the strongest, bravest man I ever knew. His voice broke. He died in 1970, helicopter crash. I was still in country when it happened. I couldn't even go to his funeral. And when I came home, my parents were so destroyed by grief, they couldn't talk about him. So we didn't. We just pretended he'd never existed. And eventually, they died too. And I was the only one left who remembered. Martha's heart shattered. Walter, why didn't you tell me? Because I couldn't, Walter said, tears streaming down his face. Because every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. Because losing Marcus broke something in me that never healed. Because I felt guilty that I survived and he didn't. Because I didn't know how to tell you that the reason I come here every Tuesday isn't just for Billy and the others. It's for him. It's for my brother. Martha knelt beside him and pulled him into her arms. Oh, Walter. Oh, my love. They cried together in front of Marcus Higgins's grave. Two people who'd been married for 52 years, finally sharing the deepest, most painful truth of all. And when the tears finally stopped, when there was nothing left but the quiet sound of their breathing and the rustle of wind through the trees, Martha pulled back and looked at her husband. We're going to clean his stone, she said firmly. We're going to make it shine. And then you're going to tell me about him. I want to know everything. I want to know who Marcus was, what he loved, what he dreamed of. I want to know your brother. Walter nodded, unable to speak. Together, they cleaned Marcus Higgins's headstone, scrubbing away 40 years of neglect, 40 years of silence, 40 years of grief that had never been allowed to breathe. And when the stone was finally clean, when Marcus's name gleamed in the late afternoon sun, Walter sat back and began to talk. He told Martha about the brother who'd taught him to ride a bike, who'd protected him from bullies, who'd written him letters from Vietnam full of jokes and encouragement and promises that they'd both make it home. He told her about the day he'd learned Marcus was dead, how he'd screamed until his voice gave out, how he'd felt like his entire world had collapsed. He told her about the guilt, the anger, the crushing weight of being the brother who survived. And Martha listened. She held his hand and listened, and she let him pour out 40 years of grief and love and loss. And when he was finished, when there were no more words left, she said the thing he needed to hear most. Marcus would be proud of you. He would be so proud of what you've done, how you've honored him and all the others. You're a good man, Walter Higgins. The best man I've ever known. Walter broke down again, and Martha held him, and the sun set over the cemetery, casting long shadows across the graves of forgotten soldiers who were forgotten no more. The weeks turned into months. Winter came, bringing snow and ice and bitter cold. But Martha and Walter went to the cemetery every Tuesday without fail. They bundled up in heavy coats and gloves and hats, and they knelt in the snow and scrubbed headstones and talked to the dead. Some Tuesdays were harder than others. Some Tuesdays, Walter's body ached so badly he could barely move, and Martha did most of the work while he sat on the folding stool and directed her. Some Tuesdays, the grief was so heavy they could barely speak, and they worked in silence, letting their actions speak for them. But they never missed a Tuesday. Not once. Word began to spread in their small town. People noticed that Martha and Walter were going somewhere together every week. noticed the supplies in the back of Walter's truck, noticed the dirt under their fingernails and the exhaustion in their eyes. And slowly, quietly, people began to ask questions. Carl from the hardware store was the first. He pulled Walter aside one day and asked point blank what they were doing. Walter hesitated. Then, for the first time in 40 years, he told the truth. "We're tending graves," he said. "Graves of soldiers who died in Vietnam. Soldiers no one else remembers." Carl stared at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I help?" Walter blinked, stunned. "What? Can I help?" Carl repeated. "I'm not doing anything on Tuesdays, and I'd like to help." The next Tuesday, Carl showed up at the cemetery with his own supplies. He worked alongside Walter and Martha, cleaning headstones and listening to Walter's stories. And when they finished, he shook Walter's hand and said, "Same time next week." Walter nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The following Tuesday, Carl brought his wife. The Tuesday after that, a neighbor joined them, then another, then another. Word spread through the town like wildfire, and soon, every Tuesday, a small group of people gathered at Riverside Veterans Memorial Cemetery to clean the graves in the forgotten section. They came with brushes and buckets and kneeling pads. They came with coffee and sandwiches and thermoses of hot soup. They came with questions and stories and a desire to help. And Walter, who'd spent 40 years carrying this burden alone, found himself surrounded by a community that wanted to share it. Martha watched it happen with tears in her eyes. She watched her husband, the man who'd been so afraid to let anyone see his pain, open up and let people in. She watched him teach them how to clean the stones properly, how to scrub without damaging the granite, how to speak to the dead with respect and reverence. She watched him transform from a man burdened by grief into a man empowered by purpose. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was what healing looked like. One Tuesday in early spring, as the snow melted and the first green shoots began to push through the earth, a young woman appeared at the cemetery. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair and nervous eyes, and she approached Walter hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Walter Higgins?" Walter looked up from the headstone he was cleaning. "I am." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My name is Sarah Reeves. My grandfather was Daniel Reeves. He's buried here." Walter's breath caught. He stood slowly, staring at the woman. "Daniel Reeves, PFC, died in 1969. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I never knew him. He died before my father was born. But my grandmother told me stories. She said he was buried here, in this cemetery, but she could never afford to visit. She died last year, and before she passed, she made me promise I'd find his grave and make sure it was taken care of." She looked at the headstone Walter had been cleaning, the one marked Daniel Reeves, and she gasped, "That's him! That's my grandfather! And his stone is clean! It's beautiful!" Walter's throat tightened. "I've been cleaning it for 40 years. Sarah stared at him, disbelieving. "Why?" "Because he deserved to be remembered," Walter said simply. "Because he served his country and gave his life, and no one should die and be forgotten." Sarah broke down, sobbing. Martha stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the young woman, holding her while she cried. And when Sarah finally pulled away, she looked at Walter with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for taking care of him. Thank you for remembering." Walter nodded, unable to speak. Sarah knelt in front of her grandfather's grave, placed her hand on the clean stone, and wept. And Walter and Martha and all the others who'd gathered that day stood in respectful silence, honoring a connection that had been 40 years in the making. That night, as Walter and Martha lay in bed, Walter turned to his wife and said, "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" Martha asked. "To let go," Walter said quietly. "Not of the promise, not of the men, but of the guilt, of the weight. I've carried it for so long, Martha, and I'm tired. I'm ready to let someone else help carry it." Martha took his hand. "You already have. You have me. You have Carl and the others. You have a whole community now. You're not alone anymore, Walter. You never have to be alone again." Walter's eyes filled with tears. "I love you, Martha. I love you so much." "I love you too," she whispered. "And I'm proud of you. So proud." They held each other in the darkness. Two people who'd spent 52 years building a life together, and who were finally, truly building a life together. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. The following Tuesday, Walter and Martha arrived at the cemetery to find something extraordinary. The forgotten section, which had been overgrown and neglected for decades, had been transformed. The weeds had been cleared. The grass had been mowed. New flags had been placed at each grave. And standing among the headstones were dozens of people. People from their town and from neighboring towns. People who'd heard about what Walter and Martha were doing and who wanted to help. Carl stepped forward, grinning. "Surprise? We figured if we're going to do this, we should do it right." Walter stared at the crowd, at the clean graves, at the flags fluttering in the spring breeze. He looked at Martha, and she smiled, tears streaming down her face. "You did this," she said softly. "You started this, and now look what it's become." Walter couldn't speak. He could only stand there, surrounded by community and purpose and love, and feel the weight he'd carried for 40 years finally, fully lift. They'd spent that Tuesday not cleaning graves, but celebrating them. People brought flowers and placed them at the headstones. Someone brought a guitar and played the national anthem. Someone else read the names of all 43 men buried in the forgotten section, reading them slowly and clearly so that everyone could hear, so that everyone could remember. And when the last name was read, when the last note of the anthem faded into silence, Walter stepped forward. He stood in front of Billy Cross's grave, the grave of his best friend, and he spoke. "These men gave everything," he said, his voice strong and clear. "They gave their youth, their futures, their lives. They served their country with honor and courage, and they deserve to be remembered, not just today, not just on Memorial Day or Veterans Day, but every day, every single day." He paused, his voice breaking. "For 40 years, I've come here alone. I've cleaned these graves, and I've talked to these men, and I've kept my promise to make sure they're not forgotten. But I don't have to do it alone anymore, because you're here. You're all here. And together, we're going to make sure these men are never forgotten again." The crowd erupted in applause. People cheered and cried and hugged each other, and Walter stood there, tears streaming down his face, feeling more alive than he had in decades. Martha walked over and took his hand. "You did it," she whispered. "You kept your promise." Walter looked at her, at the woman who'd stood by him for 52 years, who'd followed him into his pain and helped him carry it, who'd loved him even when he couldn't love himself. "We did it," he said. Together, they stood there, hand in hand, surrounded by community and memory and love, and they knew that this was not an ending. It was a beginning of healing, of connection, of a legacy that would outlive them both. Because the men buried in the forgotten section of Riverside Veterans Memorial Cemetery were forgotten no more. They were remembered, they were honored, they were loved. And every Tuesday, without fail, people gathered to make sure they stayed that way. Walter Higgins had kept his promise, and in doing so, he'd given his community a gift they would never forget. The gift of remembering those who gave everything so that others could be free. the gift of honoring the forgotten, the gift of love that transcends death and time and silence. And as the sun set over the cemetery that day, casting golden light across the clean headstones and the fluttering flags, Walter Higgins stood with his wife and his community and felt, for the first time in 40 years, at peace. End.